Peiss, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us to celebrate Dress for Freedom, the fashionable politics of American feminism. My name is Heather, and I'm the publicity manager at the University of Illinois Press. And I'm just going to go over some brief logistical information and introduce our guests before we get started. First of all, thank you so much to Dr. Rabinovitch-Fox and Dr. Peiss for being here today. They're going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then we will have time for a 20-minute Q&A at the end. You can enter questions throughout the event by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can use promo code HOLIDAY50 to get a 50% discount on the book on the University of Illinois Press website. I'll put the promo code and a link to the book in the chat box. We will also be recording the event and posting it on our YouTube channel afterwards. You'll receive an email from Zoom after the event that will have both the discount code and a link to our YouTube channel as well. And now I will just briefly introduce our guests. Einav Rabinovitch-Fox teaches U.S. and women's and gender history at Case Western Reserve University. Her research examines the connections between fashion, politics, and modernity, particularly how visual and material culture have shaped and reflected class, gender, and racial identities. In Dress for Freedom, she explores women's political uses of clothing and appearance to promote feminist agendas during the long 20th century. Her writing has been published in the Journal of Women's History, the International Journal of Fashion Studies, American Journalism, as well as the Washington Post, The Conversation, Public Seminar, and Dismantle magazine. You can follow her on Twitter at Dr. Einav R. Fox. Kathy Peiss is the Roy F. and Jeannette P. Nichols Professor of American History at the University of Pennsylvania. Her work explores modern American cultural history, gender and sexuality, consumer culture, and the history of books, libraries, and information. She is the author of Information Hunters: When Librarians, Soldiers, and Spies Banded Together in World War II Europe, published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Other books include Cheap Amusements, Working Women and Leisure in Turn-of-the-Century New York, Hope in a Jar, The Making of America's Beauty Culture, and Zoot Suit, The Enigmatic Career of an Extreme Style. She has also served as a consultant to museums, archives, and public history projects, and appeared in the documentary films New York, Miss America, and The Powder and the Glory. And now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Rabinovitch-Fox and Dr. Peiss. Thanks again to everyone for being here today.
Well, thank you for the invitation to attend, and I'm just really excited to be able to talk about Einav's book. I'm going to hold it up here for everybody to see. It was a great pleasure to read it and to think about two terms that are often diametrically opposed, feminism and fashion, and to see how we might completely rethink the relationship between those two. So I'm going to start by asking, what led you into writing this book and thinking about the relationship between feminism and fashion?
Yeah, so I mean, I, like maybe many others in the audience, do see myself as feminist. And for me, thinking about feminism, and I was kind of like, I think, coming in a generation that feminism was kind of like an assumption more than something you need to fight for. But there were still those other assumptions, this that I don't feminist, but I'm a feminist, but type of people that kind of like and this discomfort to be identified as feminist, and I felt that much of this discomfort is about kind of like, but I really like to wear lipstick, or I really like to, and that makes me a bad feminist to some degree. And when I kind of like went in and started to research earlier feminist and kind of like dwell into the feminist movement, what caught my eye was actually all the report of the suffragists and kind of like their activities, and how reporters always was mentioning how beautiful they were and how, you know, fashionable they were. And they are talking about that all the time. And I was like, well, so how come, you know, we got that myth, or how come we got that stereotype? And as I kind of like read into more and more sources, I got to understand maybe there's more of a complicated story to be told than just like, oh, feminist or anti-fashion. Because when I looked at the sources, I was like, well, they do talk about fashion and they do enjoy it. And many do see them as beautiful women. So where is this juncture come from? And I hope that, in the book, I kind of like answered the question that, in fact, it is a myth and we need to dismantle it and to really rethink why do we have it? Because feminists themselves certainly didn't think that fashion is outside of their interests.
So let me ask you, just a follow-up to that. So where does the myth come from?
So it is a backlash. I mean, and it is, I think that the kind of like originating story is with what we now know is the bloomer costume of the 19th century. That was a very much PR fiasco. And the press really used that to hammer against women's rights advocate and against the suffragist movement. And it was kind of like an easy trope to ridicule feminists and to kind of like ridicule the movement. But it was a very powerful trope that really continued into the 20th century and really was, to some degree, a trauma for early century feminists. And it was kind of like this originating myth that they were like, okay, we need to do everything, but not to be recognized with that image, because it did started to get into kind of like this very easy way of attacking feminists. So, but I think that the movement themselves, I mean, they were really, it was really intentional, right? It wasn't just about, I mean, they really thought about how they appear in public and what clothes they wear, because they were very careful to kind of like not to give weapons to the people who come against them. So I think, to some degree, it is kind of like a backlash. But it, to a certain degree, I think that also feminists did succeed in challenging that myth.
And I think your book shows that really clearly, and that's the emphasis of your book. And we'll get into some of the details of the different kinds of fashions that feminists adopted or commented upon. But I wanted, just for the audience's sake, I wanted to ask you to like give the big picture on your book and sort of what the most important takeaways are. What do you want your readers to learn after they've read your book?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the main thing is that really that what we wear matters, and it's not just a frivolous issue. And I think we have this discomfort to kind of like, oh, we shouldn't judge people, and especially women, according to how they look. But I think there is a merit to discuss the political importance of clothes, that because clothes are not just clothes. And so I think that if that's the only thing that people can take out of my book, and to start to thinking what they themselves wear, that will be great. But what I really want people to understand, it's not just that we shouldn't think about feminism and fashion as opposing forces, but really to think about how fashion can be empowering and can be really an everyday practice of feminism. And because we oftentimes thinking about activism as something that you need to be in a movement or something that is very structural and very rigid to some degree. But I think that what fashion enable us is also to enjoy it, right? To put pleasure into kind of like thinking about feminism, but also on how kind of like everybody can be a feminist, and how can you in your everyday life really practice and convey those ideas, even if you're not kind of like marching in the streets, fighting for kind of like, and like we need to go out in the streets and to fight for rights. I mean, I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we also need to think about how everyday life is also part of that struggle, and not just kind of like those moments of organizations or moments of activism.
One of the things I liked, especially in your book, was that you helped to explain how feminist ideas, which start out with small and often very radicalized people, become mainstreamed, get into the culture, become more widely accepted, and that's partly through fashion and style. So why don't we turn to some of the specifics of your study, and you start at the turn of the 20th century with the New Woman, with the Bohemians, and getting into the flappers. And I wondered if you'd like to just talk about what their clothing choices meant, and if you want to pull up some images,
yes,
everybody will be able to see that as well.
Sure. So let me share the screen. So what we see here is the shirtwaist, which is really the female version of a dress shirt, of a male dress shirt. And it was really the first ready-made items for women that was really mass manufactured and really revolutionized the fashion industry at the time. And really, because women's bodies are really hard to standardize, as many women know, right? There's no identical number 10 size, as we all know. And that was, for a long time, the industry did not want to standardize clothes for women because it was kind of like thought as very difficult. But what the shirtwaist did, because it wasn't really fitted into a body, it was kind of like more loose, it could have been standardized to certain sizes and bodies that enabled, to some degree, the democratization of fashion. So even if there were differences in grades in terms of the quality of the shirtwaist, and the poor grade certainly did not survive many laundries, or I mean, they were really cheap, but they didn't survive the great life of it. And more upscale shirts we do have some of them and did survive, but they looked relatively the same. So even if you were a middle class or an upper class woman, or if you were a working class woman, you could look like a middle class woman, even if your quality of clothes was not so great, but the style was very much the same. And it gave, especially people who were marginalized, to become part of this fashion world and part of that conversation, and a way for them to be fashionable as well. And fashion, and to be in fashion and to be fashionable, suddenly becomes a right for women. So when you see garment workers striking, to get better wages and better working conditions, they're also fighting for the right to be acknowledged as women and as Americans and as beautiful women, because they have the right to do that too. And the same thing with African Americans. They also kind of like using fashion to make those claims for inclusion, for equality, because if we can dress the way that white people dress, we should also receive the same respect that middle-class white women deserve. And what enabled that, it was not only the shirtwaist, but really the image of the Gibson Girl that really becomes this new epitome of this new woman. She's more athletic, she's a college graduate oftentimes. She represents this new idea of femininity that really goes into this idea of mobility, of freedom, of independence. You often see her alone, unchaperoned. And while Gibson himself, Charles Dana Gibson, who was the illustrator, did imagine a white middle class womanhood when he kind of like conceived of that image. That image was so ubiquitous that other groups of women could adopt it, even if not in the term itself that had its own problems, but the look. And once everybody was a Gibson girl, right? So you can really tell if someone was a middle class or working class. I mean, and that created this notion that we're all part of this fashion world and we all deserve to be part of it. We can all be new women or Gibson girls to that matter.
And one of the things that strikes me, you don't have a photo, but I've seen them of women bicycling and how much bicycling and wearing these outfits, not wearing trousers or split skirts or anything, how much bicycling was this sense of freedom and even linked up with emancipation.
Right, because it was, unlike other sports that were like traditionally men and women had to kind of like, you know, fight to get into that, cycling was new thing. So women really kind of like took over that and very enthusiastically. But because it did provide mobility in ways that, you know, was not available. You could just take a bike and, you know, drive wherever you want. And that sense of freedom really, really helped kind of like changing ideas about what women can do. And you're right, there were not, I mean, despite the fact that sometimes you kind of like look at them and ask yourself, like, how did they do that? And how did not fall right from the bicycle with those skirts? But they did, but it was considered an advancement and progress, those skirts. I mean, it for us in the 21st century, it's really hard to see that these are kind of like considered to be short skirts, even if they just reach the ankle. The fact that they were not trailing on the ground, the fact that they might have been boot high even, that we won't consider that maybe very short today, but for these women, the ability to wear those short skirts did symbolize, you know, freedom. And it was also kind of like a tangible freedom. It wasn't only symbolic in that sense.
Yeah. So you also, moving forward a little bit in time, you talk about a specific group of feminists who are associated with a kind of bohemian urban life. Often they're in Greenwich Village, and they too embrace kind of new styles of fashion to articulate a sense of freedom.
Right, and they do kind of like adopt the more Oriental fashions at the time. There's like Oriental craze in the early 1910s, really infatuation with Japan, with Asia, and really a new conception of a human body, right? Thinking about more comfort, about kind of like more abstract idea of the body. And we do see kind of like moving away from more fitted, corseted images to more kind of like loose kaftans or loose kind of like kimonos, that for these radical bohemians is not just about freedom of movement and kind of like the ability to get rid of the corset and to free their bodies, but it also, again, this idea of femininity that goes into it, that is more erotic, that is more sensual to some degree, And it also plays with kind of like imperial understandings of, you know, the Japanese as more feminine. So, but, you know, they as American women, as white women, can embrace it. And again, they're not challenging so much kind of like the gender hierarchies like a bloomer would do, or a pair of pants, but they're kind of like joining into what already is acceptable and already is mainstream and claiming it as their own and as a way for them to convey those ideas of freedom and independence, and this idea that that fashion is really a choice, that they're not against fashion, they're against kind of like the fashion industry in a sense of like, they're saying, like everybody can wear what they want, and that shouldn't be kind of like criticized or ridiculed, and we shouldn't just abide to one fashion or what the designers say. We need every woman should really find kind of like what suits her and what, you know, they feel good in it. And that's the real freedom, right? The freedom to choose. And it's something that really will continue, I think, throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, they're very interesting because they're so, their understanding of feminism is so much about self-expression and creativity. And I think a lot of those loose kaftan-like clothes reinforce that.
Yeah.
If we go forward, really just almost, you know, a few years later, we have the flapper phenomenon that most people know something about, and everything seems to change, at least in the look of fashion, as well as hair and cosmetics. Do you want to talk a little bit about the flapper as a feminist?
Sure. So this is an image of a suffragist that also kind of like adopted those shirt or skirts. But really the flapper is begins a new era of fashion. And it really is one kind of like the moment that is modern fashion. And I think, you know, when people go to costume museums and they're looking, I mean, the 20s are the first maybe decade where people can imagine, oh, I can wear that. I mean, that makes sense. And it's not just kind of like from a far away historical drama. And part of it was because there is a new understanding of the female body that is much more mobile, it's much more useful. The rise of youth, but it also is a bodily sensation. I mean, and I think those two images really shows the contrast. And women really lost around 10 pounds from only from the weight of the clothes and hair. And they oftentimes did it overnight. I mean, it wasn't a gradual process, and kind of like, right? So the way you move in the world suddenly without this weight of 10 pounds really can change what you can do and how you can, you know, think about yourself in the world and how you move in the world. So it's, on the one hand, it's also a very sexual, even though kind of like we think about the boyish look as something that is maybe androgynous or not very sexual, it was considered very, very much, you know, part of the criticism of the flapper was that she was too sexual, that she was too revealing. So it's suddenly, but it's a really a period where women do dress for themselves. And not for anybody else. So it's kind of like really shows, you know, we now have the vote, we now can, you know, go into the workforce, and this is why we need, you know, comfortable clothing. We driving cars now, and all those activities that the light clothes suddenly makes them possible.
You have a great set of drawings, and I gather you did them yourself in the book, of you know, the style year by year in the 1920s, and you show how much there actually are a number of changes, and we tend to think of it as a kind of standard style of the 20s until the Great Depression, but they all have that drop waist. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the drop waist and what that was about.
Yeah, so it is about after we got to kind of like years and years of kind of like those waspy or kind of like notion of women, the drop waist really enables to think about more rectangular and form of the women's body. Breasts suddenly disappear, right? But what we do see is legs. So skirts do get, I mean, and they do fluctuate throughout the decade, but around the mid-20s, they do kind of like reach the knee height and stay there. And suddenly women shows legs, and that's a really big revolution. And the focus, because of the drop waist, moved to the legs and not to the bosom. And so it's not a really rejection of femininity the way it is rejecting of motherhood. And this understand that, you know, that the only function of women is kind of like to be mothers and to breastfeed their children. Suddenly, the focus is on the legs and what legs can do, God forbid, right? And when you and this idea of mobility, these ideas of, you know, now people also dancing the Charleston and all that new dances that really shift this idea of what a woman is and what a woman should do. So even, you know, and if you look at advertising from this period. So the flapper is also is often married, right? They do sell housewives, but the housewife looks like flappers because now you don't need to be a mother. You can only be, you know, you could be yourself. You can be a wife, but you can you first of all a woman and what that means. So I think it really is shifting kind of like this idea of what freedom means for these women.
So feminists of this time period, I mean, the movement had kind of declined, but there were women who, called themselves feminists or had feminist politics. What was the reaction to these kinds of styles? Were they in favor or were they opposed?
Many of them were in favor of it. And, it did become even, again, for minorities, a way to participate. It become kind of like this uniform of a generation. And when the industry do push to changes the style, people do push back. Women do push back, and feminists also kind of like joining these women, and they say no, like the way we won the vote, that's the way we also won the right to wear short skirts, and you're not going to take either of that from us. And so feminists themselves, I mean, understand, and there is a shift also in kind of like feminist thinking that it's not about really organizing, but feminism is becoming more individualized and more emphasis on kind of like self-expression and self-choice. And fashion is kind of like this very useful way of doing it. Even though they do organize again and boycott and again against the industry when they in 1929 when the industry pushes for longer lengths, and feminists are really behind all those women who not necessarily define themselves as feminists per se, but understand that there's something very fundamental about freedom that be able to vote and be able to choose what to wear is really at the basis the same right.
Yeah, and the photographs of the Black women are just really spectacular. I mean, you really get a sense of their modernity and their pride and their appearance, and how important those clothes must have been. especially for migrants to the city or to people who were, new to the world of purchasing fashion or, going out in leisure time and the like. So those really the photographs themselves really are very expressive.
Yes, and it is. I mean, and it's not just. I mean, it really is. It also gets to conflict sometimes with parents who are coming from the old world and have more time to adjust to kind of like modernity. But it also, again, a way for them to be part of society and part of the inclusion, and to demand, we can have the same pleasures of life as our white peers. And it's whether if they're African Americans or they're Chinese Americans or Mexican Americans, all this younger generation, the way for them to claim to be American citizens is through really participating in this new culture and through fashion.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that also is interesting to me is how much this is understood as an American style. And if we go forward a little bit in your book, you have this really great chapter that is about women designers of clothing and their organization, the Fashion Group, and how they are establishing an American design and style in the 1930s and 40s. And here we've been looking mainly at consumers and women who are wearing the styles. When you get to the 30s and 40s, you have this very prominent group of designers and producers of fashion. So could you talk a little bit about them?
Sure. And I think the fashion industry or the creative industries were a way for women to gain positions of power, and because they did seem to be more feminine or more acceptable a way of professions that women could get used to positions of power because they knew kind of like the feminine taste. But so it does become a route for a career for these women, but they coming in this sense of that we are, as women, we need to make styles for women like us. So, right, so we have this understanding of what it means to be an independent woman, and we need to make clothes that are by women and for women. And they're mostly young, they're mostly white. So what they think of what is the modern American woman is pretty much narrow. But again, it is part of this notion that what defines Americanism is this sense of style and sense of freedom and sense that you don't need to give up your femininity in order to look independent and to be on the go, kind of like, more comfortable styles. I mean, and those examples, they are very functional clothes on the one hand, but they're very beautiful. And things that, many of us would like to wear even today, and they're kind of like, they're good quality. But they're also available for mass consumption. And it is, and I think the fashion industry, I mean, today we think about it as very corporate run, but in the early 20th century, and even through the 30s and 40s, it's not as corporatized as it is today. So it does allow women more freedom, and especially in America, because Paris is the capital of fashion, right? They have the tradition, they have this idea of guilds and how you make couture. But then those new American designers come and say, well, we do things differently, right? We need to design for the regular, to the average woman. We're not doing couture, even though that today in museums they are being, framed as couture. But they did work in the retail industries. They really were kind of like on a mission to make clothes for American women, for the average American women, and to show Paris, right? it is become kind of like, as the war get heated, it is become kind of like also a patriotic project to show women that, you know, the American style is even superior to the Parisian style, that because we are designing for the average woman to the modern woman, we're not thinking about this, you know, rich matrone, that we are design clothes for women who work, for women who maybe stay at home but needs to be kind of like on the go, and for career women like themselves. We do see a lot of women getting into executive positions in the fashion industries or the creative industry in that moment, that, you know, the 50s would kind of like, will change some of it. But it is kind of like this golden age, I think, of women in fashion that stays also. And it does become kind of like branded as this American style, that there's something uniquely American about doing functional clothes. And that reputation certainly goes on as, you know, the rivalry between Paris and New York will become kind of like, even after the war, more and more, as New York will become kind of like a more important fashion center, even globally.
Yeah, I love the Claire McCardle dress, and with the caption, "I'm doing my own work." And this is housework, of course, but it's a very fashionable outfit, and the big pocket she made, as you say, this is functional clothing that's also beautiful clothing. And you have an image of a simplicity pattern. So many women, especially in the 1930s, the Great Depression, would be able to sew their own versions of these items.
Right. And there's also this, and I think that's part of, again, this idea of choice and ideas of creativity. And that's kind of like the feminist element of those clothes, that it's, and women did know how to sew, but even kind of like the image in the left, that you can kind of like tie the belt, you know, in the way that you feel good about it, or so you can participate in the design of the clothing, even if you're not a designer, to a certain degree. So like, you choose the way you want to look. And it is this kind of like empowering, that everybody can be a designer to a certain extent, even by, you know, adding a belt or by adding, you know, something to the dress, that really hones into this idea of independence, that it's not just, you know, women taking whatever the industry tells them to do.
Yeah, and the whole rise of sportswear is part of this, I believe, women's sportswear. And as you said, World War II for the American fashion industry is very good, because Paris is kind of closed down with the occupation, or at least it's closed down for Americans. So that really is an opportunity to establish an American style for women.
Right, and to think, who is the American woman, and who do we design for, right? And the war does give them kind of like this opportunity. But even after the war, when you know, Christian Dior is coming up with a new look, and everybody's gushing and kind of like the return of Parisian fashion, but many women in America says, no, like, wait a minute, nobody asked us, like, and they do fight again, like in the 20s, we see them again fighting for to keep that sportswear. They don't abandon sportswear, because it became part of their identity, but it also kind of like, they say, we're not like, now a French designer will tell us what to wear. We're not going to do that. So they're organizing. They are, and the new look is not very successful in the United States. You know, it is maybe on the cover of Vogue, but in department stores, women vote with their purses, and Dior needs to change the new look for the American market and make it more comfortable. And because Americans have the money, he eventually abandons the new look because American consumers are the one who are calling the shots.
Yeah. So I want to turn to the 1960s era feminism, and also just invite members of the audience to put questions in the Q&A for Einav if you have any. We'll continue for a bit, but I hope that some of you will have some good questions. So I guess being a child of second wave feminism, it's the version of feminism that I know best as having a kind of pushback to fashion and consumption and sexual objectification through appearance. And you have an argument that says, well, wait a minute, it's not that simple. So could you give us that argument?
Sure. So yeah, it's not that simple. And when you, and again, I think in very similar ways to the feminists in the 1910s, even feminists in the 1960s and 70s, and of course, feminism is not, one movement or monolithic. And there were certainly radical feminists who were like really against anything that has to do with fashion. But the majority of it, and even the more radical movement of it, we're not against fashion per se, but more against the industry and against kind of like making women to dress according to someone's whims. So kind of like this concept of choice is really is really powerful on a lot of issues, right? About abortion, about other and is also going into appearance and the way we can present ourselves in a way that will reflect our politics. So a feminist can be someone with a mini skirt, but a feminist can also be someone who's wearing a jeans and having kind of like a more unisex look. But they really did look at fashion as something that is fun, and not only is fun, and they didn't kind of like wanted to give it up because it was fun, but also because it was useful to convey who they were. So you see kind of like lesbian styles are kind of like going into, and it's a way of self-fashioning in a way that really suit your politics. So they really understand that it's a tool. It's not something, and there are fighting against the industry, against oppression, against to say, oh, all women needs to wear lipstick. But if wearing lipstick that's what makes you feel good about yourself, go ahead and do it, because that the most important issue is choice. And if you think about, and the media do kind of like try to make it to make them look as bra burners and as radical and as ugly women. But if you look at feminist icons like Gloria Steinem, she's very, very far from not being beautiful, right? And she starts a fashion of hair, and all women have and the glasses, right? So she is herself becoming this fashion icon that is also a feminist fashion icon. And she's not alone. There are others like her in the feminist movement that do not reject beauty or fashion per se, but kind of like saying, well, it needs to be an individual choice. So kind of like the personal is political really gets kind of like the manifestation in their fashions.
Yes, I think that's right. And I'm speaking from my experience of, being in high school and having one of my, all of us wearing mini skirts, and one of my classmates liberating us to wear jeans and then getting thrown out of school for like 3 consecutive days. And finally they gave up. And, so what is, we all felt the mini skirts were, liberating in a sense, but also being able to wear pants to school was as well. So there's some questions, and I think maybe I'll just repeat them to
Sure.
you. From Karen Kedrowski, 2 questions. Did the invention of the sewing machine allow for mass production of clothing, and with it employment opportunities for women? And second, do you talk about the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and its ramifications?
Sure. The sewing machine is interesting because factories, big factories, do not use sewing machines the way we use at home. So the Zinger is kind of like and was marketed for housewives, so you can do your sewing at home. And for a long time, especially kind of like in the era of the Triangle Fire, the sweatshops are at home, so you don't go to a factory, right? There's no big machines. You do those piecemeal work at home with your sewing machine, or that you rent a sewing machine. So it is enables to some degree the industrialization of fashion and the mass manufacturing of fashion, for sure. But what was really, I mean, the first mass-made items are uniforms, right? The Civil War is a big kick to ready-made fashion, because suddenly you need to produce uniforms in large numbers. But for a long time, it was considered that women's body cannot, it's not like women's fashion cannot be mass produced, because they do need to be fitted to the body. So so once the industry kind of like figures out, and the industry is kind of like an ally to some degree, because the flapper fashions are much easier to make than kind of like a more fitted styles. So the industry is actually in favor of doing it, because that enables them to mass manufacture lots of clothes for women to make money. So that definitely kind of like pushes this ready-made issue. And I talk about more about the strike that was before the Triangle Fire, the 1909 strike, that really kind of like, and again, women, working class women were striking along with rich women, and kind of like the Mink Brigade, they were called. But both of them are getting arrested. And part of kind of like the newspapers are saying, well, you know, both of them are wearing shirtwaist, and it's really hard to recognize kind of like Mary Dwyer or Anne Morgan among those strikers, because they wear the same thing. So there is kind of like this sense of solidarity, and not that there weren't tensions between those fractions, but there is a sense of solidarity through fashion. And what Triangle Fire does, in a sense, it really changes the way the industry works. So it does bring an end more to kind of like the pirate workshops and the kind of like the work at home, and moves it into the factory, and bringing those guardrails and safety procedures, and so in that, and also, I mean, but the 1909 strike is really one that organizes the industry. And again, it was a working force that wasn't considered to be organizable to begin with. And the 1909 strike really shows that what we need is unions, and what we need is the votes, so we won't have a Triangle Fire again. So in that regard, you know, that shows up, I guess, in the book.
Okay, so another a comment and a question from Anne Gray Fisher. She thanks you for the fascinating talk, and many congratulations on publishing this excellent history. She'd like to hear more about your research process and any of your favorite archival gems.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the problem with fashion, when you research fashion, I guess, is that most of us do not write manifestos every time you dress up in the morning. And that kind of like, you know, I was really looking for this smoking gun that some feminist said, yes, I wore that skirt today because, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I did eventually found some smoking guns like that, but really quotes when they were interviewed in newspapers. But it's not really, because it's kind of like an everyday practice, you really had to think differently about the sources, and also going and I spent time in costume collections and kind of like, because I really do think that seeing the clothes really shifts kind of like, you kind of like, oh, wait a minute, this is not really, you know, when you see a corset, yes, it's narrow, but if you kind of like do the measurement of, you know, people were also shorter, so it's actually not that narrow. So you, and illustrations, especially in the early 20th century, are not kind of like the most accurate. So seeing the clothes, really kind of like working with the clothes, helps you to really understand what it means. I mean, you know, I looked at a bathing suit that was from wool, and I was like, why would anyone would do it to himself, herself, right? To wear this wool. But it's something that unless you see it, like you can see from an image that this bathing suit that looks very liberating, right? It was like, it was sleeveless and it was very short, but it was also from wool. So I was like, okay, so sometimes freedom is not kind of like just ultimate freedom, right? There are those limitations that after you get from the beach and with soaked water wool, you might kind of like not find it the most enjoyable thing to do. But it's fun to look at costume collections, I have to say. And it's also fun. I mean, I read a lot of women's magazine, which, you know, at one point becomes a job, so it's not fun anymore. But that's another kind of like a way to get into the fashion and not just kind of like what people say. So the visual, and I think like you really need to think visually about what it means.
Great. So another question from Jeannette Gale. Do you explore the way Black fashion veers into a different expression of freedom in the 1970s?
Yeah, and Black feminists are really interesting in that aspect because, and again, we do think about kind of like 1970s feminists as kind of like anti-fashion or kind of like more critical of fashion. And they do, and white women do adopt kind of like more the unisex styles or the jeans, but Black women are not seeing it as a liberation necessarily. So Black feminists are much more emphasizing femininity and emphasizing kind of like this idea of fashion and high fashion as their road to liberation. So, you know, even if you take Shirley Chisholm, who was elected to be the best dressed person in Congress, right? And she really understood how fashion is important to her political image, but she was also kind of like a very kept woman. You would not see her with an afro, on the other hand, right? And more radical women do adopt more radical styles, but for them, liberation is not necessarily in abandoning fashion or in abandoning kind of like the right to fashion, or making yourself ugly. And there's a lot of criticism from Black feminists that they say, you know, you might feel great when you don't wear makeup, but for me, it's not a liberation because I was told all my life that I can do those things. So for me, liberation is actually to become part of it. I mean, alongside the No More Miss America protests that did kind of like generated the myth of the bra burning feminists at that time, there's also a protest of Black women to become part of that competition and to have their own right to be Miss America and to be acknowledged for their beauty.
Okay, some more questions. This is great. From Scout Weber, earlier you explained that the first mass-produced tops allowed women to blur class lines. Do you think this is still true today?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think yes. I mean, fast fashion do kind of like work in a way that, you know, most of us cannot afford Chanel or kind of like couture brands, but Zara and H&M are actually that's what they're doing. They're copying the styles and they're making, an affordable look that fast fashion allows it. So we do have, I think, in that terms, kind of like similar things. But today I feel that fashion is so individualized. There's no like one trend. There was never one trend, but today there's much more trends than there used to be, and much more seasons. So it's really, you can also get away with somehow of not being part of fashion to a certain degree today in a way that I don't think was available in the early 20th century. But yeah, I mean, we all wear at the end of the day, there's a wonderful Meryl Streep when she was playing in The Devil Wears Prada, when she beautifully explained even when we don't want to, we're all part of the same system.
So we have a couple more questions and only a couple more minutes. So I'm going to put them all together and you can choose. You've got about 3-4 minutes left. From Lara Vapnek, she's wondering about what you think about the shift towards slimness during the flapper era as opposed to the Gilded Age, when women look more substantial. And how did technology change undergarments and also the clothes that women wore? And then a question about accessorizing. How was the disappearance of hats in everyday wear? How did it influence the feminist movement?
Yeah, those two great questions. So yeah, undergarments are an important part of the story, and kind of like moving from corsets to bras and kind of like getting rid of bras, right, in the 70s, which was another look. So there's definitely, again, ideas about how shaping the body and the slimness of the flapper was part of her youthfulness to some degree. I mean, there were also binding, people binding their chest, and the flapper ideal was certainly not available to everyone, especially for fat women. But it was also, I mean, Liz Clyburn is like, that's where she begins her career. This understanding that you can also be a flapper. I mean, even if your body or your color of the skin that flapper is more kind of like an ideal and an idea, and not kind of like you don't need to be 20, you can also be 60 in a flapper, right? And that enables you to become part of that conversation. So actually bras in the 20s were much more comfortable than they are today. And there were really kind of like understanding that they were part of this, again, freeing the body, very lightweight, that is a shift from the Gilded Age that was more supple, but again, it's about the shift from the emphasis on the bosom, that's what the corset does. It kind of like lifts the breast, to kind of like more emphasis on the legs, that kind of like makes the bosom disappear. But then in the 40s, we get waist again, but the notion is still kind of like free, and and that's also true to accessories and the way that hats are functioning in society. We are kind of like moving into, I think, a more casual, a more kind of like free styles by the 60s and 70s. So it's about not necessarily rejection of femininity, but rejection of formality. And I think we have 1 more minute, so I'll stop here.
So I think maybe we should, I think those are all the questions. So Einav, thank you so much. Heather, you may want to come back in.
Yeah, thank you both so much. This has been such a fascinating conversation. If anybody want to get a copy of Dress for Freedom, they can use promo code HOLIDAY50 on the University of Illinois Press website to get 50% off. And that discount code goes through the end of December. So get one for your mom and all your friends as well. So thank you both so much, and everyone have a great rest of your evening.
Pleasure.
Thank you.